when security cameras at the prestigious Blackwood estate captured Lady Catherine attempting to wire £2.3 million to an offshore account at 3:47 a.m., it triggered a scandal that would shake one of Britain's most powerful families to its core. What the footage revealed was just the beginning of a web of deception that had been years in the making. The morning fog hung thick over Blackwood estate as Margaret Phillips, head of security, reviewed the overnight surveillance footage in her cramped office. She had been doing this job for 15 years, watching over one of England's most influential families, and nothing much surprised her anymore, until today. The timestamp read 3:47 a.m. when Lady Catherine Blackwood appeared on camera 5, moving through the East Wing with purpose that seemed unusual for someone who should have been asleep. Margaret leaned forward, adjusting her glasses as she watched Catherine slip into the estate's private office, a room that housed the family's most sensitive financial documents and computer systems. Margaret's coffee grew cold as she continued watching. Catherine moved with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. She powered up the main computer, inserted what appeared to be a USB drive, and began typing rapidly. The security chief had seen enough suspicious activity over the years to recognize it when it was happening right in front of her. 23 minutes later, Catherine emerged from the office, looking around carefully before heading back toward the main residence. Margaret immediately switched to the office's internal cameras and began reviewing what had happened inside. Her heart sank as she watched Catherine access the family's primary banking system and initiate what appeared to be a substantial wire transfer. The Blackwood family had built their fortune over 3 generations, starting with Lord Henry Blackwood's shipping empire in the 1920s. His grandson, Lord James Blackwood, had expanded into real estate and technology, making the family one of the wealthiest in Britain. The current patriarch, Lord William Blackwood, had inherited not just vast wealth, but also the responsibility of managing family members who sometimes saw that wealth as their personal playground. Catherine had married into the family 12 years earlier, when she wed Lord William's younger brother, Charles. The marriage had been celebrated as a perfect union between 2 prestigious families, but those close to the Blackwoods knew that Catherine had always struggled with the restrictions that came with her elevated position. She wanted independence, wanted control over her own finances, and had grown increasingly frustrated with the family's traditional approach to money management. Margaret picked up her secure phone and dialed Lord William's private number. It was barely 6 a.m., but she knew he would want to know about this immediately. William had always been an early riser, and Margaret had learned over her years of service that bad news was best delivered without delay. "Sir, this is Margaret. I need to speak with you about something urgent that happened during the night. Could you come down to the security office when you have a moment?" Lord William's voice was crisp, despite the early hour. "I'll be there in 10 minutes. When William arrived, Margaret could see the concern in his eyes. He was a man who had learned to read situations quickly, a skill that had served him well in both business and family matters. She showed him the footage without commentary, allowing him to see for himself what his sister-in-law had been doing in the small hours of the morning. His jaw tightened as he watched Catherine's nighttime activities unfold on the screen. "How much?" he asked quietly. Margaret had already run the preliminary checks. "Initial analysis suggests approximately £2. 3 million, sir. The transfer was initiated but appears to have been flagged by the bank's automated systems because of the unusual timing and amount." William closed his eyes for a moment, processing the implications. This wasn't just about money, though £2.3 million was certainly significant. This was about trust, about family loyalty, and about the very foundations upon which the Blackwood legacy had been built. "Where was the money going?" he asked. "A private account in the Cayman Islands, sir, registered under a company called Meridian Holdings. I've run a preliminary search, but I'll need more time to trace the ownership." William nodded slowly. He had dealt with family crises before, but nothing quite like this. Catherine wasn't just a distant relative causing embarrassment at social events. She was married to his brother, lived in the family home, and had been trusted with access to sensitive areas of the estate. The betrayal cut deep. "Have you spoken to anyone else about this?" William asked. "No, sir, just you. I wanted to follow protocol and report to family leadership first." "Good. I need you to prepare a complete report of everything you've found, but keep this strictly confidential for now. I need to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with before we take any action." Margaret nodded and began gathering the relevant files. She had worked for the family long enough to understand the delicate balance between protecting their interests and maintaining family harmony. This situation threatened both. As William left the security office, his mind was already racing through the possible explanations for Catherine's behavior. Was this a one-time desperate act, or had she been systematically moving family funds for some time? Was Charles involved, or was Catherine acting alone? And most importantly, how many other people knew about what had happened? The estate's morning routine continued around him as if nothing had changed. Staff members went about their duties, gardeners tended to the extensive grounds, and the family's cook prepared breakfast in the main kitchen. But William knew that everything had changed. The trust that held the family together had been fractured, and he wasn't sure it could be repaired. He found Charles in the breakfast room, reading the morning papers and drinking coffee. His younger brother looked up with a smile that made William's heart ache. Charles had always been the more trusting of the two brothers, quick to see the best in people and slow to suspect ulterior motives. This conversation was going to devastate him. "Good morning, William. You're up early, even for you." William poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down across from his brother. "We need to talk, Charles, privately." The tone of his voice must have conveyed the seriousness of the situation because Charles immediately folded his newspaper and gave William his full attention. "What's wrong?" "It's about Catherine. Margaret found something on the security footage from last night that we need to discuss." Charles's expression shifted from concern to confusion. "Security footage? What could Catherine possibly have done that would show up on security footage?" William took a deep breath and began explaining what Margaret had discovered. He watched his brother's face change as the reality of the situation sank in. Confusion gave way to disbelief, then to a kind of hollow shock that William had only seen once before, when their father had died. "That can't be right," Charles said quietly. "Catherine wouldn't. She knows how important family trust is to everything we've built here. There must be some explanation." "I hope you're right," William replied. "But we need to investigate this thoroughly before we can determine what actually happened and why." Charles stood up abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the estate's main gardens. "Where is she now?" "Still asleep as far as I know. I wanted to talk to you first before we confront her about this." "We have to talk to her," Charles said, turning back to face his brother. "We have to give her a chance to explain what happened." William nodded, though he wasn't as optimistic as his brother about what that explanation might reveal. In his experience, when people were caught doing something they shouldn't be doing at 3:47 in the morning, the explanations were rarely innocent. "Before we do that, though, I want Margaret to complete her investigation. I want to know exactly how much money we're talking about, where it was going, and whether this was an isolated incident or part of a larger pattern." Charles sat back down heavily. "How long have you known about this?" "Margaret called me about an hour ago. I came down here as soon as I could review the footage myself." "An hour," Charles repeated. "Just an hour and everything feels different." William understood what his brother meant. Trust was like that. It could take years to build and seconds to destroy. The question now was whether anything could be rebuilt from what remained. They spent the next hour discussing their options. Their voices kept low, even though they were alone in the breakfast room. By the time Catherine came downstairs for her morning coffee, both brothers had agreed on their approach. They would present her with what they knew and give her an opportunity to explain herself fully before deciding on their next steps. Catherine entered the breakfast room with her usual morning energy, kissing Charles on the cheek and greeting William with a warm smile. She seemed completely normal, showing no signs of stress or guilt that might indicate she was aware her nighttime activities had been discovered. "Good morning, you two. You both look serious. Important business discussions this early?" William exchanged a glance with his brother. "Actually, Catherine, we need to discuss something important with you. Could you sit down for a moment?" Something in his tone must have alerted her because her smile faded slightly, but she sat down without comment. "Catherine," Charles began carefully, "we need to ask you about something that happened last night, something that was captured on the estate's security cameras." The color drained from Catherine's face so quickly that William was afraid she might faint. Her hands trembled slightly as she set down her coffee cup, and for the first time since William had known her, Catherine Blackwood looked truly afraid. The silence in the breakfast room stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Catherine's face had gone completely pale, and her hands shook as she tried to maintain her composure. William could see the wheels turning in her mind as she tried to figure out exactly how much they knew and what her options were. "Security cameras?" she finally managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not sure what you mean." Charles leaned forward, his expression a mixture of concern and pain. "Catherine, please don't make this harder than it already is. We know you were in the office last night around 3:47 a.m. We know you accessed the family banking system. We just want to understand why." Catherine's composure crumbled completely. She put her face in her hands and began to sob quietly. The sound was heartbreaking, but William forced himself to remain focused on getting answers. Tears could be genuine remorse, or they could be a calculated response designed to evoke sympathy. "I'm sorry," she whispered through her tears. "I'm so sorry. I never meant for it to go this far." "What never meant to go this far?" William asked gently but firmly. "Catherine, we need you to explain everything from the beginning." She looked up at both men, her eyes red and puffy. "It started months ago, maybe longer. I don't even remember exactly when it began." Charles reached over and took her hand. "What started, darling?" "The gambling," she said so quietly they had to strain to hear her. "It started with just small bets online, just for fun. Something to do when I was bored." But then, William felt a cold dread settling in his stomach. Gambling addiction could explain a lot, including why someone might feel compelled to move large amounts of money in the middle of the night. "How much have you lost?" he asked. Catherine's sobbing intensified. "I don't know exactly. A lot. More than I could ever repay on my own." Charles looked stricken. "Why didn't you come to me? Why didn't you tell me you were having problems?" "Because I thought I could fix it myself," she said. "Every time I lost, I thought the next bet would be the one that got me back to even. I thought I could win it all back, and you'd never have to know." It was a story William had heard before, though never from a family member. The progression from casual gambling to desperate attempts to recoup losses was tragically common. But knowing the pattern didn't make dealing with it any easier when it hit this close to home. "The money you tried to transfer last night," William continued, "where was it really going?" Catherine took a shaky breath. "To pay back what I owe. I've been getting calls, threats. They said if I didn't pay by the end of the week." "Threats?" Charles interrupted, his voice sharp with alarm. "What kind of threats? Who has been threatening you?" "The people I owe money to. They're not the kind of people who just write off debts. They made it very clear what would happen if I didn't pay." William's mind immediately shifted to security concerns. If Catherine owed money to dangerous people who knew where she lived, that put the entire family at risk. "How much do you owe them?" he asked. Catherine was quiet for a long moment. £2.5 million. The number hung in the air like a physical presence. It was a staggering amount, more than many people would see in several lifetimes. For the Blackwood family, it was manageable financially, but the implications went far beyond money. $2.5 million, Charles repeated slowly. "Catherine, how did it get to be so much?" "It wasn't all at once," she said defensively. "It built up over time. And when I couldn't pay, they started adding interest and fees. The amount just kept growing." William was already thinking through the security implications. "Catherine, I need you to tell me everything about these people. Names, how you contacted them, how they contacted you. Everything." "I can't," she said, fresh tears starting. "They said if I told anyone, if I involved the police or anyone else, they would what?" William pressed. "They would hurt Charles. They know who we are, William. They know about the family, about the estate. They said Charles would pay the price if I didn't handle this quietly." Charles went white. "They threatened me specifically?" Catherine nodded miserably. "They showed me photos, William. Photos of Charles leaving his office. Photos of him at his club. They know his routine. They know where he goes." William felt anger building inside him, but he forced himself to remain calm. This had become much more than a family financial crisis. This was now a security threat that required immediate professional attention. "Catherine, we're going to handle this. but I need you to trust me completely from this point forward. No more secrets, no more trying to solve this on your own. Can you do that?" She nodded, looking relieved for the first time since the conversation had begun. "Yes. I'm sorry, William. I'm so sorry I let it get this far. We'll deal with apologies later," he said. "Right now, we need to focus on making sure everyone is safe and resolving this situation." He stood up and walked to the breakfast room's secure phone. "I'm calling our security consultant and our family attorney. We need professional help with this." As William made his calls, Charles sat with Catherine, holding her hand and speaking quietly to her. William could hear fragments of their conversation, Charles reassuring her that they would get through this together, Catherine apologizing repeatedly for putting him in danger. Within an hour, 2 additional people had arrived at the estate. David Morrison was the family's security consultant, a former Scotland Yard detective who specialized in dealing with threats against high-net-worth individuals. Sarah Chen was the family's attorney, someone who had handled sensitive matters for the Blackwoods for over a decade. The 4 of them gathered in William's private study while Catherine remained in the breakfast room with Charles. William brought them up to speed on everything they had learned, from Margaret's discovery of the security footage to Catherine's confession about the gambling debts and threats. "The first priority has to be securing the family's safety," David said immediately. "If these people are professional enough to conduct surveillance and make credible threats, we have to assume they're capable of following through." Sarah nodded in agreement. "We also need to document everything carefully in case we need to involve law enforcement later. Even if we choose to handle this privately for now, we want to preserve our options." "What about the money?" William asked. "Do we pay what she owes?" David considered this carefully. Paying might resolve the immediate threat, but it could also mark the family as an easy target for future extortion attempts. These people might see you as a source of ongoing income if you demonstrate a willingness to pay large sums under pressure. And if we don't pay, then we need to be prepared for them to escalate their threats. We would need to implement serious security measures for everyone in the family until the situation is resolved. William looked out the window at the peaceful estate grounds. In the space of a few hours, his family's safe haven had become a potential target. "What do you recommend?" "I think we need to bring in law enforcement," David said. "Professional criminals making extortion threats against British citizens is something the authorities take very seriously, and the gambling operation Catherine was involved with is likely illegal as well." Sarah agreed. From a legal standpoint, paying the extortion only creates more legal complications. If these debts stem from illegal gambling operations, any payments could be seen as supporting criminal enterprises. William made his decision. "Set up a meeting with the appropriate authorities. But I want this handled as discreetly as possible. The family's privacy has to be protected." "Of course," Sarah replied. "I'll reach out to my contacts at the Metropolitan Police. They have units that specialize in these types of cases." As the meeting continued, William found himself thinking about Catherine and Charles. His brother's wife had made terrible choices, but she was still family. And Charles loved her despite everything that had happened. Finding a way forward that protected everyone while preserving what remained of family unity would require careful navigation. "What about Catherine herself?" he asked. "She's obviously dealing with addiction issues that go beyond just paying off these debts." David nodded. Gambling addiction treatment should definitely be part of any solution. And given the amounts involved and the threats, she may need psychological support to deal with the trauma of being extorted. "I can recommend several discrete treatment facilities that specialize in gambling addiction among high-net-worth individuals," Sarah added. "The family's privacy would be completely protected." William felt some relief knowing there were options available, but he also knew the road ahead would be difficult. Trust, once broken, was hard to rebuild. And even if they resolved the immediate crisis, the underlying issues that had led to this situation would take time and effort to address. A knock on the study door interrupted his thoughts. Charles entered, looking exhausted and worried. "How is Catherine?" William asked, scared but relieved that it's all out in the open. "She wants to do whatever it takes to make this right." Charles looked around the room at the assembled professionals. "What's the plan?" William brought his brother up to speed on the recommendations they had discussed. Charles listened carefully, asking occasional questions but generally agreeing with the approach. "What about the money Catherine tried to transfer?" Charles asked. "The bank stopped it, but what if these people find out the payment didn't go through?" David had already considered this. We'll need to contact them through whatever channels Catherine was using and explain that there was a delay with the transfer. That should buy us some time while we work with law enforcement to set up a proper response. Catherine will have to make that contact, Sarah added. Any deviation from her normal communication patterns might raise suspicions. Charles looked uncomfortable with the idea of Catherine having any further contact with the people who had threatened him, but he understood the necessity. "I'll talk to her about it," he said. "She'll do whatever you think is best." As the afternoon progressed, plans began to take shape. Law enforcement would be contacted discreetly. Security at the estate would be increased immediately. Catherine would enter treatment for her gambling addiction as soon as arrangements could be made. And the family would work together to navigate the challenges ahead. But William knew that even the best plans couldn't undo what had already happened. The family had been changed by this crisis in ways that might not become fully apparent for months or years to come. Detective Inspector Rebecca Hayes arrived at Blackwood Estate on a gray Tuesday afternoon, accompanied by Detective Sergeant Michael Torres from the Metropolitan Police's Serious Crime Unit. William had specifically requested officers who had experience with high-profile cases and could ensure the family's privacy while thoroughly investigating the extortion threats. Catherine sat in the estate's formal living room, looking smaller and more fragile than William had ever seen her. The past 3 days had taken a visible toll. She had barely slept, barely eaten, and spent most of her time either crying or staring blankly out windows. Charles hadn't left her side except when absolutely necessary. "Blackwood," Inspector Hayes began gently. "I understand this is a difficult situation, but we need you to tell us everything about how this began and who you've been in contact with." Catherine nodded shakily. "It started on a website called Royal Flush Gaming. I found it through an advertisement on social media. It looked legitimate, professional. Do you still have access to the website?" Sergeant Torres asked, pulling out a tablet to take notes. "Yes, I think so. I haven't tried to log in since," she glanced at William, "since everything came out." Inspector Hayes leaned forward slightly. "We'll need you to show us that website and any communications you've had with these people. But first, can you walk us through how a casual gambling habit turned into debts of this magnitude?" Catherine took a shaky breath and began her story. It had indeed started innocently enough. Small bets on card games and roulette during lonely afternoons when Charles was at work, and the estate felt too quiet. The website had been sophisticated and user-friendly, with customer service representatives who were friendly and helpful. "At first I was actually winning," she explained. "Not huge amounts, but enough to make it exciting. The customer service people would call to congratulate me on big wins and offer me bonuses to keep playing." William noticed Inspector Hayes and Sergeant Torres exchange a meaningful glance. They had clearly seen this pattern before. "When did the wins stop?" Inspector Hayes asked. "Gradually at first. I'd win some, lose some, but overall I was losing more than I was winning. The customer service people told me this was normal, that there were streaks and I just needed to be patient." "And when did the amounts start getting larger?" Sergeant Torres prompted. Catherine's voice became even quieter. "They offered me credit, said that as a valued customer they could extend me a line of credit so I wouldn't have to keep depositing my own money. It seemed reasonable at the time." Charles squeezed her hand supportively, though William could see the pain in his brother's eyes as he listened to the details of his wife's deception. "How much credit did they extend initially?" Inspector Hayes asked. £50,000. It seemed like a lot, but they assured me it was standard for someone of my status. They said people like me typically had much higher credit lines. William felt sick. The gambling operation had clearly targeted Catherine specifically because of her family connections and wealth. They had studied her background and tailored their approach accordingly. "When did you realize you were in serious trouble?" the inspector continued. "When I tried to withdraw my winnings after a particularly good night. I had won almost £200,000, and I thought I could pay back the credit and still come out ahead. But when I tried to withdraw the money, they said there were processing issues that would take time to resolve." "Processing issues?" Sergeant Torres repeated, making a note. "What happened next?" "I kept playing while waiting for the withdrawal to process. I told myself I was just keeping busy, but really I was hoping to win even more. And of course, I lost everything I had won and more." The story continued in a depressingly predictable pattern. More credit was extended, Bigger bets were encouraged. Losses mounted while withdrawals remained delayed due to processing issues. By the time Catherine realized she was trapped, she owed far more than she could ever hope to repay from her personal allowance or assets. "That's when the phone calls started," she said, her voice barely audible. "At first, they were just friendly reminders about my account balance, but then they became more insistent, and then threatening." "What exactly did they threaten?" Inspector Hayes asked. Catherine looked at Charles, who nodded encouragingly. "At first, they said they would have to report the debt to credit agencies, which would affect my husband's business relationships. Then they said they knew where I lived, where my husband worked, our daily routines." "Did they make specific threats of physical violence?" Sergeant Torres asked. "Yes. They said if I didn't pay within 2 weeks, they would send someone to collect. They also said they had photos of Charles leaving his office and knew his schedule well enough to arrange a meeting if necessary." Inspector Hayes made several notes. "Catherine, we're going to need you to show us the website, any emails or messages you received, and your phone records of these calls. We'll also need access to your bank statements to trace exactly how money moved between your accounts and theirs." "Of course." "Anything you need." William had been quiet during most of this exchange, but now he spoke up. "Inspector, what are we dealing with here? Is this an isolated operation targeting my family or something larger? Based on what Mrs. Blackwood has described, this sounds like a sophisticated operation that targets wealthy individuals specifically. The pattern of easy early wins, gradually increasing credit, delayed withdrawals, and eventual extortion is one we've seen before. Have you been able to shut down similar operations?" "Some of them," Inspector Hayes replied carefully, "but these groups are often based offshore and use sophisticated technology to hide their tracks. The investigation can be complex and time-consuming." Sergeant Torres looked up from his notes. "The immediate concern is your family's safety. These people have demonstrated they're willing to conduct surveillance and make credible threats. We need to take that seriously." David Morrison, who had been quietly observing from across the room, spoke up. "We've already increased security at the estate and arranged for protection details for family members when they leave the property. But we need to know what the police can do about the immediate threat. We'll be coordinating with international law enforcement to investigate the gambling operation," Inspector Hayes explained. "But in the short term, we recommend that Catherine make contact with them to buy us more time." Catherine looked alarmed. "You want me to call them?" "We want you to send whatever type of message you normally would," Sergeant Torres clarified. "Tell them there was a delay with the bank transfer, but that you're working to resolve it. We need to keep them from escalating while we gather more evidence." Charles looked uncomfortable. "Is that safe? What if they realize something has changed?" "We'll coach Catherine on exactly what to say," Inspector Hayes assured him, "and we'll be monitoring all communications from this point forward." Over the next hour, the detectives worked with Catherine to craft a message that would seem natural while buying them time. The message explained that her bank had flagged the large transfer as unusual and required additional documentation before releasing the funds. She estimated it would take another week to resolve the banking issues. "Will they believe that?" William asked after Catherine had sent the message. "Probably," Sergeant Torres replied. "Large transfers to offshore accounts do get flagged by banks regularly. It's a plausible explanation that doesn't suggest any change in Catherine's willingness to pay." Inspector Hayes closed her notebook. "Now we wait for their response and continue building our case. In the meantime, everyone in the family needs to be extremely careful about their routines and security." After the detectives left, the family gathered in William's study to discuss what came next. The investigation would take time, and there were no guarantees about the outcome. In the meantime, they had to live with the constant awareness that they were potentially being watched by dangerous people. "I've been thinking about Catherine's treatment," Charles said quietly. "She needs help with the gambling addiction, but she also needs protection. I don't want her going to a facility where these people might be able to find her." William had been thinking the same thing. Sarah is looking into residential treatment programs that have experience with high-profile clients. Security would be part of the package. "When would I have to go?" Catherine asked. "As soon as we can make arrangements," William replied. "The sooner you get help, the better. And honestly, the sooner you're somewhere safe and secure, the better I'll feel about everything." Catherine nodded, though she looked scared. "Will Charles be able to visit?" We'll work out visitation arrangements that don't compromise anyone's security, William assured her. As evening approached, the family tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy. They had dinner together, though conversation was stilted and forced. Catherine barely touched her food, while Charles seemed lost in his own thoughts. William found himself constantly listening for unusual sounds and checking his phone for updates from the security team. Later that night, William sat in his study reviewing security reports, when Sarah called with an update on treatment options. "I found a place," she said. "Serenity Springs in Scotland. It's a residential facility that specializes in gambling addiction among high-net-worth individuals. They have excellent security and complete discretion. Catherine could check in as early as tomorrow if you decide to move forward. What's involved? Initial assessment, then typically a 90-day program. Individual therapy, group sessions, family counseling when appropriate. They have a very good success rate." William considered the option. 90 days seemed like a long time, but if it helped Catherine overcome her addiction and kept her safe while the investigation proceeded, it was worth it. "I'll discuss it with Charles and Catherine in the morning," he decided. "William?" Sarah's voice became more serious. "There's something else. I've been doing some research into similar gambling operations, and I found some concerning patterns." "What kind of patterns?" "These groups don't typically limit themselves to gambling debts. Once they have hooks into a wealthy family, they often expand into other types of extortion. Blackmail, insider trading schemes, even money laundering operations." William felt a chill run down his spine. "Are you saying this might not end even if we pay what Catherine owes?" "I'm saying we need to be prepared for the possibility that this is just the beginning. These people may see your family as a long-term asset rather than a one-time payday." After hanging up, William sat in the darkness of his study, looking out at the estate grounds that had been in his family for generations. Everything they had built, everything they had worked to preserve, was now under threat from people who saw their wealth and status as opportunities to exploit. The morning would bring new challenges and difficult decisions, but tonight, William allowed himself a few moments to grieve for the family's lost innocence and the trust that had been shattered by a few moments of poor judgment in the early hours of a quiet morning. 6 weeks later, William stood at the window of his study watching the morning mist roll across the estate grounds. The view was the same as always, but everything else had changed in ways both obvious and subtle. Armed security officers now patrolled the perimeter. Motion sensors had been installed along every access road. The peaceful sanctuary his family had known for generations had become a fortress. Catherine had been at Serenity Springs for 5 weeks now, and the reports from her treatment team were cautiously optimistic. The gambling addiction was being addressed through intensive therapy, but the deeper issues of anxiety and depression that had contributed to her vulnerability were requiring more time to resolve. Charles made the drive to Scotland every weekend to visit her, always with a security detail and always taking different routes. The visits were difficult for both of them. Catherine was dealing with guilt and shame that went far beyond the immediate crisis, while Charles was struggling to reconcile the woman he loved with the reality of what her actions had set in motion. The police investigation had made significant progress, though Inspector Hayes warned that building a prosecutable case would take months. The Royal Flush Gaming website had been traced to servers in Malta, but the operation was controlled by a criminal organization based in Montenegro. The money trail led through a complex network of shell companies and cryptocurrency exchanges, designed to obscure the source and destination of funds. The good news, Inspector Hayes had explained in their last meeting, is that we've identified several other victims and we're working with international partners to build a comprehensive case. The bad news is that these people are professionals, with extensive resources and experience evading law enforcement. The immediate threat seemed to have subsided somewhat. Catherine's message about banking delays had been accepted, and the criminals had given her additional time to arrange payment. But William knew this was temporary. Eventually, they would expect their money, and when it didn't come, they would escalate their approach. David Morrison knocked on the study door, interrupting William's thoughts. The security consultant had become a regular presence at the estate, and William had grown to value both his expertise and his calm demeanor in crisis situations. "Good morning, sir. I have updates on several fronts." William gestured for him to sit down. "Good news or bad news?" "Mixed, I'm afraid. The good news is that we've had no suspicious activity around the estate for 2 weeks. No surveillance, no unusual vehicles, no attempts at contact. It's possible they've moved on to other priorities while waiting for Catherine to resolve her supposed banking issues. And the bad news? David's expression grew more serious. Inspector Hayes called this morning. They intercepted communications suggesting that the organization is planning to demand additional money beyond what Catherine originally owed. William felt his stomach drop. How much additional money? They're calling it interest and administrative fees for the delays. Another £1 million on top of the original $2.5 million. Sarah warned me about this, William said grimly. She said these groups often see wealthy families as long-term assets rather than one-time payouts. There's more, sir. The communications also mentioned expanding the relationship with your family. The details weren't clear, but it suggests they're interested in ongoing arrangements rather than just collecting this debt. William stood up and began pacing. He had known this moment would come, but it still felt like a punch to the stomach. What does Inspector Hayes recommend? She wants to set up a controlled operation, have Catherine make contact, and arrange what appears to be a payment, but actually use it as an opportunity to gather evidence and identify key players in the organization. How dangerous would that be for Catherine? There would be risks, David admitted, but she would be under constant protection and the meeting would be in a location chosen by law enforcement. They would have multiple teams in place to ensure her safety. William considered the option carefully. Using Catherine as bait was dangerous, but it might be their best chance to end this threat permanently rather than just postponing it. What does Charles think about this? He doesn't know yet. Inspector Hayes wanted to discuss it with you first before involving the rest of the family. William nodded. Arrange a meeting for this afternoon. I want to hear all the details before we make any decisions. Later that morning, William drove to Scotland to visit Catherine himself. He hadn't seen her since she entered treatment, and he was struck by how different she looked. The constant stress and fear that had marked her features for weeks were gone, replaced by a clarity and calmness he hadn't seen in years. You look well, he said, as they sat in the facility's private garden. I feel better than I have in a long time, she replied. The therapy is difficult, but it's helping me understand how I got to this point. I'm learning to face problems instead of trying to escape from them. How much has Charles told you about what's happening with the investigation? Enough to know that this isn't over yet. Dr. Miller says that expecting instant resolution was part of my problem. I always wanted quick fixes instead of accepting that some problems take time and work to solve. William studied his sister-in-law carefully. She seemed stronger than she had been, but was she strong enough to handle what might be asked of her? Catherine, there may come a time when we need your help to end this threat permanently. It could involve some risk, but it might be our best chance to protect the family and ensure these people can't hurt other families the way they've hurt ours. Catherine met his gaze steadily. If you need me to do something to fix what I caused, I'll do it. I owe that to Charles, to you, to everyone who's been affected by my mistakes. I want you to focus on your recovery first, but I wanted you to know that there might be difficult decisions ahead, and we may need to rely on your courage and strength. I understand, she said quietly. And William, thank you for not giving up on me. I know it would have been easier to just cut me loose and protect the rest of the family. William felt an unexpected surge of emotion. Despite everything that had happened, Catherine was family. And family meant something, even when it was complicated and painful. That afternoon, William met with Inspector Hayes, Sergeant Torres, and David Morrison to discuss the proposed operation. The plan was complex but carefully designed to maximize the chances of success while minimizing risk to Catherine. We would set up what appears to be a standard debt collection meeting, Inspector Hayes explained. Catherine would bring a briefcase containing what looks like the money they're demanding, but it would actually be marked bills that we can trace. We would have teams positioned around the meeting location and electronic surveillance on Catherine at all times. What's the goal? William asked. Just to identify these people, or to arrest them? Both, if possible. But primarily to gather evidence that can be used to dismantle the entire organization. This group has victimized dozens of people across Europe, and this might be our best chance to put them out of business permanently. Sergeant Torres added, We've worked with the facility in Scotland to ensure Catherine's continued safety regardless of what happens with the operation. If these people somehow discover her location, she can be moved to a secure facility that even we don't know the location of. William appreciated the thoroughness of their planning, but he still had concerns. What if something goes wrong? What if they suspect it's a trap? There are risks, Inspector Hayes acknowledged. But Catherine would never be alone or unprotected. And honestly, sir, doing nothing is also risky. These people aren't going to disappear just because we ignore them. When William returned to the estate that evening, he found Charles waiting in the study with Margaret and Sarah. They had been discussing the family's long-term security needs and the question of whether life could ever return to normal. "How did Catherine seem?" Charles asked immediately. "Stronger, more like herself than she's been in months. The treatment is helping." William brought them up to speed on the proposed operation, watching Charles's face carefully as he explained what would be asked of Catherine. "Absolutely not," Charles said immediately. "I won't put her in danger to help catch these people. Let the police find another way." "Charles," Sarah said gently, "there may not be another way. And if we don't stop this now, Catherine may never be safe. You may never be safe. She's been through enough. She's finally getting better, and you want to drag her back into this nightmare." William understood his brother's protective instincts, but he also knew they needed to consider the broader picture. "Charles, what if this organization decides to target other wealthy families? What if they use what they've learned about our security and routines to hurt other people?" Charles was quiet for a long moment. "What does Catherine think about this?" "I didn't give her details, but I told her we might need her help. She said she was willing to do whatever was necessary to fix what she had caused. Of course she said that. She feels guilty about everything that's happened. But feeling guilty doesn't mean she should have to put herself in danger." Margaret spoke up for the first time. "Sir, if I may, in my experience with security matters, threats like this rarely just go away on their own. They either escalate or they're resolved through direct action. Waiting and hoping isn't a strategy." Charles looked around the room at the assembled professionals and his brother. "If we do this, what guarantees do we have that Catherine will be safe?" "There are no guarantees," Inspector Hayes had said earlier. "But we'll do everything in our power to protect her." It wasn't the answer Charles wanted to hear, but it was the only honest answer they could give. The discussion continued late into the evening, covering every aspect of the proposed operation and its potential consequences. By the time they reached a decision, William felt mentally and emotionally exhausted. They would proceed with the operation, but only after Catherine had completed her initial treatment program and felt ready to participate. They would also insist on additional security measures beyond what the police had initially proposed. Most importantly, the final decision would be Catherine's to make. She would be presented with all the facts, all the risks, and all the alternatives. Whatever she decided, the family would support her completely. As William prepared for bed that night, he thought about how much his family had changed over the past several weeks. They had discovered reserves of strength and courage they didn't know they possessed. They had also learned that wealth and privilege provided no protection against human weakness and the consequences of poor decisions. But they had survived. They had faced a crisis that could have destroyed them, and they had remained united. Whatever tomorrow brought, William was confident they would face it together. The next morning brought news that would test that confidence once again. Catherine's message about banking delays had finally been challenged. The criminals were demanding proof that the money was coming, and they wanted to meet in person to discuss expanded business opportunities with the Blackwood family. The endgame was approaching, and everyone would soon discover whether their carefully laid plans were enough to end the threat that had shadowed their lives for months.